Hello everyone. I'm here again to talk to you about fairy tales. In particular, I'm going to talk about Little Red Riding Hood. She's one of the first ones that I kind of really did a deep study on, and she's very interesting. I'm not sure why I started with her because she, although, a great fairy tale, she wasn't necessarily one of my most favorite fairy tales, but she's become one of my favorite fairy tales as I'm now a grown woman as opposed to a child, because she's not as glamorous as her other princess cousins. And Little Red Riding Hood is one of the few fairy tales that doesn't actually have any royalty at all in it. There's not one single prince or princess or king and queen in it. There's not really a lot of magic in it. The real only little magical kind of element to it is that it has a talking wolf, and he ends up being the bad guy. But outside of that, she has no special powers. She's just a little girl who's going to visit her grandma in a beautiful red cape that her grandmother made for her. It's the only fairy tale of all the fairy tales that started in an oral tradition, went to written, and went back to oral tradition. So a lot of the fairy tales that we know of today actually came from oral tradition. And as you may or may not already know, a lot of the fairy tales actually were made for adults because they were told around the hearth fires. Thus the reason there is a lot of sexuality, or at least the innuendo of it, in a lot of fairy tales. And you're wondering, kind of like, why is Prince Charming suddenly kissing a sleeping girl without her permission, and things like that. And the Little Red Riding Hood that you know of today is way tamer than the original Little Red Riding Hood. So it went from oral to written, and we're going to talk about that. And then 100 years, and then it went back to oral again, and then 100 years later, it was once again put into written form, Little Red Riding Hood. It has a universal sort of appeal because it's more or less is about don't talk to the wolves of the world and let them trick you. Now there's a lot of different versions. One of the first versions was called The Story of Grandmother, which is a lot darker and a lot sort of scarier than the Little Red Riding Hood that we know of today. In fact, I've read The Story of Grandmother in some of my classes because I teach this as a class, and it's available as a book. If you want to purchase the book, I'll put the link below. But I've read The Story of Grandmother in my Little Red Riding Hood classes, and I've had women who have ended up in tears and just a look of shock on their face because it is a little dark, much darker than what we know of today. The other thing about Little Red Riding Hood is she's never had a full-length feature film made of her, and yet she's a heroine. She's not one of the helpless princesses or anything like that, especially in the older versions. She's a rock star and the ultimate rebel of the fairy tale world, and I think that's part of the reason why I've grown to really love her as an adult woman, because she is quite a rebel, especially when you know some of the original stuff. Now there have been lots of cartoons and a lot of short films made about her, but there's never been a full length, like Disney's Cinderella or Disney's Snow White. Little Red Riding Hood has never had a film like that really made of her. Little Red Riding Hood is a theme in of itself, and there's a lot of stories that take the Little Red Riding Hood theme and make it their own. She's been a top 10 song in the 1960s. Sam and the Sham and the Pharaohs. Sam the Sham and the Pharaohs made a top 10 hit, Little Red Riding Hood. You would probably recognize it if you heard it, in 1966. So she's had songs about her. And actually, one of her claim to fame is Little Red Riding Hood in 1925, when radio was still fairly new. She was actually the first song to ever be banned from radio because it was too suggestive. And it was by A.P. Randolph, who called his song, How Could Red Riding Hood Have Been So Good? and that was banned. And it's the first song to ever be banned from radio, and it's all about Little Red Riding Hood. And of course, some of her lines from the story Little Red Riding Hood are some of the most famous and most anticipated lines of, "Why, grandmother, why are your teeth so big?" You know, that sort of thing. So little kids love that anticipation of that scary kind of question. And it's kind of funny because we know the story of Little Red Riding Hood. She goes to visit her grandmother. The wolf tricks her. She ends up being eaten by the wolf. The woodcutter comes in, saves her, and often nowadays in modern day versions saves the grandmother out of the stomach and ends up killing the wolf. So we know the title as Little Red Riding Hood. So the first time this story was published, it was published under the title Little Red Riding Hood by a man named Charles Perrault. And this was in the 1600s. I have a 1697 when he first published this story. But this is not the story we know of as Little Red Riding Hood. We took his title as modern day people, and we've taken the Grimm's version of that story and melded those two together. So we know the Grimm's version of the story. Like I said, I just sort of highlighted it there, but their story is called Little Red Cap, not Little Red Riding Hood. But for some reason we took Perrault's title and added it to Grimm's version of the story. So kind of interesting. Now, also too, so the story of grandmother actually was out and about in oral tradition around 1000 AD. So it's quite old. There is a Chinese version as well, but in the Chinese version, there's a tiger and three sisters that are all working together against this tiger. It can be traced back a little bit further, so they say, to 3,000 years, back 3,000 years to ancient Greece. They had versions of Little Red Riding Hood. And like I said, in 1697, Charles Perrault published his version. He was the first one to put Little Red Riding Hood to paper. And his book was called The Tales of Mother Goose with Morals. So Charles Perrault was kind of famous because he took a lot of stories like Cinderella, Little Red Riding Hood, Sleeping Beauty, and he put them in written form. And in those days, back in the 1600s, it was very common for the ladies of the court to have these, what they called salons, where writers and artists and storytellers would come and tell their stories, show off their work, whether it's written or in art form or whatever it might be. These were salons of women trying to have some education and that sort of thing. So Charles Perrault loved to regale the ladies with his versions of his fairy tales. When he first published the book, though, the Tales of Mother Goose with Morals, and I'll explain the with morals in a second here, he actually published it with his son's name as the author because he was trying to make a connection. He worked as a minister, I can't remember which department he worked in, under Louis the 14th, Louis the 14th, and he wanted to get his son noticed by one of King Louis the 14th's nieces so that there could be a marriage, a connection, that sort of thing. So it wasn't his son that wrote it. It was him, and he published it, but he just kind of wanted to give his son this leg up. So with the morals, so every one of Perrault's versions of fairy tales actually has a moral at the end of it, including Little Red Riding Hood. And I have the moral here written down somewhere. I just have to get to it. So his moral reads, there it is: children, especially pretty, nicely brought up young ladies, ought never to talk to strangers. If they are foolish enough to do so, they should not be surprised if some greedy wolf consumes them, elegant Red Riding Hoods and all. Now there are real wolves with hairy pelts and enormous teeth, but all wolves who seem perfectly charming, sweet-natured, and obliging, who pursue young girls in the street and pay them the most flattering attentions. Unfortunately, these smooth-tongued, smooth-pelted wolves are the most dangerous beasts of all. So every one of his fairy tales had a little bit of a moral with it. It kind of defeats the purpose of the story, and there have been people who have studied fairy tales who have said that. And Bruno Bettelhelm, I'm not good with names, so I probably mispronounced that, in his book The Uses of Enchantment, actually says that about the fact that Charles Perrault put morals. It's like we kind of are supposed to glean the moral of the story from hearing the story, not having it spelled out to us. But it's funny, in Perrault's version, and it's only in his version, even the ancient ones don't have this, is the only one where Little Red Riding Hood dies. Sorry if it's a spoiler, but she dies and she stays dead. She doesn't, that's it. It ends with her dying, and then you get that moral of pretty young girls shouldn't be talking to wolves, otherwise they will be consumed. And it's like, oh, okay. So that's, his version is quite dark as far as that goes. Now, he did take some of, and a lot of stories and things like that are borrowed from, so he did take a piece of his version from the story of Grandmother. Because in the story of Grandmother, the Little Red Riding Hood meets the big bad wolf at a crossroads. So you don't always get that in the modern day tales. And at the crossroads, she tells the wolf exactly what she's doing. She's going to see her grandmother, who's very sick, and she tells the wolf exactly where her grandmother's cottage is, gives him directions, in fact, and he says, well, why don't we race to grandmother's house? For some reason, she thought he was a good wolf, I guess. And in the modern day version, she's often, off gathering flowers for her grandmother or whatever, because the wolf kind of tricks her into that. But at this crossroads, there's two paths, and there's one which is called the needles and one which is called the pins. And he asks her which path she would like to take. So the pins or the needles is kind of a euphemism for womanhood, because when you're a young woman, and a lot of womanly crafts at that point were about getting flax, getting wool, and making it into linens and cloth and things like that, and then sewing. So pins are what younger women were allowed to use to help with the crafting of clothes and even like covers and canvases and tents and things like that, right? And the needle is actually a very poignant time in humankind when we figured out how to use needles to sew things together as opposed to just pinning things together. So when we made our tents or teepees or whatever as our first shelters, we often just held them together with bones and we were kind of pinning them together. But then we figured out, oh, let's make a needle, let's make some thread, and we'll sew these together so there's no gaps, so there's less breakage, that sort of thing. So when the wolf offers her the choice of, do you want to take the pins or do you want to take the needles, she picks the needles because she is representing the maiden. So there's maiden, mother, crone as the stages that a woman goes through. And she's representing the maiden who's becoming more mature because she's picked the needles, because she has decided like she wants to mature and start using needles as opposed to the pins, right? Now Perrault does, I think he makes her pick the pins in his version, and he says it's because she's a lazy girl. He doesn't have a lot of good things to say about Little Red Riding Hood in his version, but anyway, she's gathering these pins or these needles on the way, and the wolf says he's going to gather the pins on the way, and he races her. Of course, he doesn't gather anything, and he just goes to Grandma's house and eats her up, and then poses himself as the grandmother. So in Perrault's version, the grandmother also dies, by the way. So they both die. After Perrault's version of Little Red Riding Hood actually goes back to oral version, and it's been around in oral for a long time, and it isn't until the Grimms start collecting fairy tales. Now, they didn't start out collecting fairy tales. What they were doing was collecting German history, German folklore, German folk stories, fairy stories, to help preserve the German language, because they had some fear that the German language was going to die. And they actually did start a dictionary. That was their main goal. It wasn't to collect the stories, but they wanted to collect the words, but they heard stories as well, and they started collecting these as kind of a historical thing. So they didn't ever finish their dictionary. They ended on F, actually, when the last brother died. But they did collect quite a few. Like, they collected a lot of folk tales and fairy stories in the Germanic language. And they actually first published their stories in 1812. So about 100 years after Perrault, they published Little Red Riding Hood again for the second time. Well, actually, there was another guy, Andrew Lang, who had the Blue Fairy book, and he published a version of Little Red Riding Hood just around the time as Perrault, and Perrault took some of that, but Lang also took some from the story of Grandmother. So they're all taking from each other. But what's kind of interesting is the Grimm's version actually has Little Red Riding Hood living at the end, and they have an epilogue. And so there's kind of like this last chapter that's left off of everyone's version, modern version of it. Now, Grimm's fairy tales, a lot of people, because I'm a fairy tale historian, a lot of people come to me and they tell me, oh yeah, I've read all the Grimm's fairy tales and that's awesome and stuff. But the Grimm's are actually considered the first of the modern day fairy tale writers. So you have to go further back in order to kind of get into this history. So it's good to know the Grimm's versions, absolutely, but they are the first of the modern day, but even their tales have been altered and whatnot. So like I said, their first publishing was in 1812. The second one was in 1856. Yes, 1856. Just making sure I'm getting my dates right here. So the 1856 version of their collection of fairy tales is actually really pared down. They had a ridiculous number of fairy tales in their first version, and a lot of their fairy tales, especially the more mainstream ones like Little Red Riding Hood, were a lot darker. They took a lot of the darkness out of Little Red Riding Hood in the 1856 version. Now, it was first published in English a little bit after that, and some of the religious views kind of filtered in, so to speak. So I'm just looking to see if I've got the date here. I don't think I do. I might have it somewhere else. But another interesting thing about the Little Red Riding Hood, going back to Perrault of the 1600s, he actually, like, they used the wolf a lot. And what's interesting is the slang of that time in the 1600s, when a girl lost her virginity, it was said that elle avout vu le loup. I'm not good at French, so please forgive me. Which actually means she's seen the wolf. So that's why his moral is avoid the wolf and that sort of thing, because meaning you've lost your virginity as well. And that was the other thing I was going to say. With the Grimm's version, like I said, we've kind of married Perrault's title to Grimm's story, but the Grimms collected their story from someone who was living in Germany, but actually was a French family living in Germany. So I kind of felt like that was an interesting coincidence, that they carried that over in the oral tradition, because, people move and migrate and whatnot. So this French family ended up in Germany, and the Grimms ended up collecting their version of Little Red Riding Hood for their tales, or for their book. And like I said, in the Grimm's version, there is that epilogue. So there's actually 2 wolves in the Grimm's version of Little Red Riding Hood. Most people don't know that. Most people think the story ends with the woodcutter coming in, killing the wolf, cutting the belly open, rescuing Grandma and Little Red Riding Hood, putting the stones, I don't know if they still include that now, into the wolf's belly, and then he wakes up apparently and he can't walk because the stones are so heavy, and he ends up dying because of these stones. But then there's a second wolf. It's the first wolf's brother shows up again. So the epilogue is kind of interesting because Little Red Riding Hood comes out of the womb, or out of the wolf's belly, kind of a little bit smarter and wiser, right? She says, never again will I not listen to my mother, and will I wander off the path, no matter what the wolves say to me, kind of thing, right? So it's kind of representative of her becoming more mature. And there's sort of a theory that when she's in the belly with the wolf, because she's also in the belly of the wolf in the story of Grandmother, which is from 1000 AD, and it's representative of the crone part of the woman, the grandmother, because there's the maiden, the mother, and the grandmother, who's the crone, giving her wisdom to Little Red Riding Hood when they're in the darkness of the wolf's belly. Because a lot of times, especially in the occult world, things are given to you in those dark moments. Not dark moments as in sad, but it's darkness where kind of like a seed gets planted in the earth. It needs to be in the darkness first. It needs to be wet and dark, and then it bursts into the sunlight, and then it needs sunlight. But it needs the wet and the dark first. So you're in the wolf with this belly, which of course if you're in a belly of anything, it's wet in there and it's dark. And that's when Little Red Riding Hood really matures and ups herself to that next stage of womanhood and gains that wisdom because of her grandmother. Now, in the story of the grandmother, she gains the wisdom actually by eating her grandmother. So there's a bit of, cannibalism that happens in the story of grandmother. The wolf tricks her into eating her own grandmother, because the wolf is actually, so it wasn't the story of grandmother where she's in the belly. That was another older version. But the story of grandmother, actually, the wolf tricks her in because he kills the grandmother and puts her in the cupboard, parts of her, and takes her blood and puts it into a bottle. And then when Little Red Riding Hood comes and he's posing as grandmother sick in the bed, he gets her to sit down for a meal of her grandmother's body parts and the blood that he's saying is juice or wine or whatever, for her to drink. So she does that, and that in that version, that's how she gains the wisdom. So it's a little bit shocking, but I mean, it's no more shocking than the Last Supper, where Jesus says, eat of my body and drink of my blood, and you shall gain redemption and be able to live forever, kind of thing. So that it's the same thing, and that is a very common theme. It's not just in the Catholic Church, it's actually a very common theme, especially in ancient times, of that sort of divinity of eating the body and drinking of the blood, but not really doing it, just in sort of like, again, the Catholic Church, you're eating a host, you're not eating the body of Christ, kind of thing. But it's sort of a representation. Now, the vampire stories, the fairy tales of those, are sort of that taken to a darker edge of things, where the vampires drink of the blood and then you become a vampire. So drinking blood and eating bodies is a common theme, both on the dark end of things and on the divine end of things. Once you do more research, you'll find that there's many themes of that in different stories. So we talk about a little bit about the wolf here. So I'm just going through the book a little bit, so I'm giving you some of the highlights, not giving you all the information. There's lots more in there, and I will give you also a copy of the story of Grandmother, so you have that. Now, the wolf was not all bad. He was the parent to the dogs, the domesticated dogs, and he also, he represents death and rebirth. He has a very mystical kind of energy about him. Odin and the goddess Hecate also, commanded the wolf. Odin's son, Hildefor, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, actually means war wolf. And then a lot of Turkish tribes say that they're descendant from the wolf mother who mated with a human. And of course the famous story of the founders of Rome, Remus and Romulus, they were nurtured and saved and raised by wolves. And there's a lot of stories of, you know, Tarzan, I think, was raised by wolves, you know, or boys being raised by wolves, and children being found and raised by wolves. So there's a lot of that sort of theme that goes on throughout history. So wolves were seen as good, but suddenly, especially sort of, fairy tales kind of became that thing where they could still talk about pagan stuff without really talking about pagan stuff and pagan beliefs and superstitions and things like that, right? That the church might frown upon. So the storytellers could get away with talking about it because it was in the form, it's just a fairy story, right? It's just a story I'm telling of mystical things that happened a long time ago. But wolves actually kind of became a really bad thing for a long time. In fact, they were hunted almost to extinction. I think only now is the wolf starting to make a comeback in Europe. I think they're extinct in England and hunted to extinction. It used to be, I think it was in 10 AD. Maybe I'm wrong about that. The 10th century. The 10th century, when if you were charged with a crime, instead of paying for it in jail time or whatever other persecution they wanted to, or punishment they wanted to put on you, you could volunteer to hunt wolves, and you had to reach a certain quota because they wanted to get rid of the wolf because the wolf was seen as a big, huge threat. And Little Red Riding Hood kind of addresses that threat a little bit because, you know, in the 1700s, 1500s, that sort of time period, famine and starvation by death, or death by starvation, I mean, was a real thing. It was a real thing to go out in the woods and potentially bad things could happen to you, not only just by the wild animals, but even by desperate people who were homeless, and not homeless in the same way that we're homeless today, sitting on the streets, but like really dire kind of circumstances on the brink of death and starvation, and probably disease. And so, you know, it was not uncommon for children not to make it to the age of 5. You know, you might have 12 children, but it used to be, you know, how many children have you had? 12. How many have survived? You know, and maybe 4 have survived, right? And even, you know, the well-off classes in those days lost children. Childbirth was a really, you know, dangerous kind of time. So was just being a child, you know, whether you made it to the age of 5 or to your teens or whatever was a big thing. So that being said, the wolf kind of became the predator, the bad guy. So it was something that you could hunt and be seen as a hero to be killing the wolf. So he became the bad guy in the stories as well. More of a euphemism for usually a man or a bad guy of some kind. Now in tarot, because I'm a tarot reader, the moon card, there's the wolf on there, and the wolf on there, he's with his domestic brother. So the wolf on there can mean a couple of different things because he has that mystical kind of death, rebirth kind of feel. You can pull that into that tarot card, but he can also, and traditionally he does represent sort of the wild side of us as human beings, the side that doesn't have the conscience, the side that will do perhaps the immoral thing, not make the best choices, that sort of thing, whereas the domesticated dog is the one who's more in control and has a conscience and thinks about what he does before he does it. So that's kind of where that goes. And in Little Red Riding Hood, we have the obvious, the big bad wolf who eats Grandma and Little Red Riding Hood. So the domesticated dog in tarot, because there's a balance there, right, is the woodcutter. He's the domesticated dog because he's the one that comes in and kind of saves the day, saves Grandma and Little Red Riding Hood, and manages to control the wolf to the point of death. So Also, too, Little Red Riding Hood, the girl who wore red. I love the idea of a red cape. It's awesome. So she is a victim and a heroine all at the same time, depending on the version of the tale that you're listening to. Just as in Sleeping Beauty, there are clues of womanhood, the tools to show the maturity of growing into womanhood. At the crossroads for Red, it's pins and needles and her choices into womanhood. For Sleeping Beauty, it was the spinning wheel is the sign of her womanhood. Sleeping Beauty finds an old crone spinning alone as her womanhood has been kind of hidden from her. These encounters with old women play a decisive role in each of their fates. The grandmother who has sewn the beautiful red cape in her cottage deep in the woods, the extremely ancient and forgotten spinner in the castle attic, both are leading the girls on the trail of the great mother, of the goddess, whose memory comes up from Paleolithic myths. She is the great mother who spins beings, because the great mother, the goddess, much like the fates, was also often pictured as spinning, because the story is she's the first, creator, and she spun the gods into existence. She also spun humans into existence, and she has spanned thousands and thousands of years and known by many, many names. Little Red Riding Hood is in the wolf's stomach with her grandmother. Many heroines go through a death-like state to be reborn again. You'll remember Snow White. She eats a poison apple, falls to her supposed death, gets put into a glass coffin, and then the prince rides by and sees her and must kiss her. So he does, and she is revived. Same thing with Sleeping Beauty. She's kissed as well, and she's revived. But they've both gone through these death-like experiences, because sleep is often compared to being as close to death as we can come without actually dying. But Red is not always devoured. As I said before, in older tellings, she often escapes and triumphs over the wolf. So in some versions, she is made, and this is a little bit, again, it's in the story of Grandmother too, it's a little bit shocking, because it's not that she's eaten, she ends up eating her grandmother, which is shocking in of itself. And then the wolf actually makes her strip down naked. And it's a little bit like, oh my gosh, they're going back and forth because he makes her take it off piece by piece. She ends up lying down beside the wolf naked. So again, he's sort of that predator, that man that shouldn't be with a little girl is with a little girl. So yeah, it gets a little weird. And then the famous conversation happens, what big ears, what big eyes, what big teeth you have, kind of thing. But in that version, he doesn't eat her. She actually ends up, before anything really bad happens, it's bad enough she's a naked little girl in bed with this big bad wolf, but before anything happens, there's a lot of sexual innuendos, don't doubt that, but she ends up saying she has to go to the bathroom, and he tells her to go to the bathroom in the bed, but she will not. And he's like, no, go ahead and go to the bathroom. And she's like, but it's number 2, or at least she says that in between the lines, that, it's not just pee that I have to do, it's poo. And so he's like, we'll still go in the bed. And she will not, because what the wolf is trying to do, is the theory of that conversation, is he's trying to strip her of any dignity and any humanity she has. And, you don't want to sit in your own filth, right? And to be more the animal, amoral kind of character that he is. But she stands her ground. So this is where she kind of becomes a bit of a heroine in this version of the story. She stands her ground and she says, no, I will not do that. You have to let me go to the bathroom. Because apparently something else is going to happen between the lines, and she wants to avoid that. So he says, okay, fine, you can go outside and go to the bathroom, but he insists on tying a rope to her ankle, and he keeps pulling the rope to make sure that she hasn't escaped. So if he feels that there's tension, he knows she's still there. But she outsmarts him, and she ends up going out to the garden to go to the bathroom, and she ties the rope, she unties it from her own ankle, and she ties it around a plum tree. Now, why a plum tree? Because mystically speaking, plums represent the unexpected, and that's exactly what she's giving the wolf, is the unexpected. And sort of, it's a bit of magic on her side as far as lucky chances, that sort of thing. So she ends up tying the rope to the plum tree, and she runs home to her mother, who is very happy to see her, even though she's naked. And he realizes, he keeps pulling, and he's like, what's taking so long? And he goes out and he realizes he's been pulling on this plum tree, and he goes to chase after her, but she's got enough of a head start, because of course he's a faster runner, and she's nude, but she's got enough of a head start that she escapes, and she closes the door and never sees him again. And, you know, kind of has learned to avoid wolves, of course. Now, in the epilogue for the Grimm's brothers, what happens is she kind of learns her lesson. She doesn't want to talk to wolves, so she's going again in the epilogue to see her grandmother. And the wolf tries to talk to her, if I remember correctly, but she sort of like, no, I'm not going to talk to you. And she races off, and she gets to her grandmother's house before the wolf can kind of really stop her. And she opens the door and she locks it, and she tells her grandmother, "Look, there's a wolf that's on my path again. He's after me." And he ends up getting to the house, and he's kind of like the big bad wolf in the little Three Pigs there. He's not exactly huffing and puffing, but he is pretty close to it. And he's like, I want to get in there, and I'm going to find a way in, ha ha ha. And so he tries different ways, and he can't get in. So he ends up going up on the roof, thinking, well, she's not going to stay there forever. She's going to have to leave at some point. So I'll just wait her out, and I'll sit up here, and I'll wait for her to leave. And when she does, I'll jump on her, or I'll chase her, and I'll get her that way. But the grandmother and Little Red Riding Hood have noticed. They know he's up on the roof, so they're not stupid. And the grandmother, apparently the day before, has been making sausages. So she has all this water that's left over from boiling up the sausages and making them and stuff like that. So she's like, why don't we pour that out in the trough so it will, you know, make him want to come down, kind of thing. So out from the window, so they gather the water, and out from the window they pour into the trough, and the wolf ends up, you know, smelling it. Oh, it smells so good. I mean, homemade sausages, come on. And if it's from Germany, even better, right? They make good sausages. So he keeps going closer and closer to the edge of the roof, wanting to smell the sausage water because it smells so good, and he ends up falling off the roof into the trough, hurting himself, breaking bones or something, and he ends up drowning in the trough. So that's the epilogue. That's the final story. So it's sort of a proof that Little Red Riding Hood has learned her lesson. She's much smarter. She's outwitted the wolf this time. And so she's the heroine at the end of even the modern day version, if they included the epilogue that the Grimm's brothers originally had with it. A lot of stories end with her just going, yay, I was saved by the woodcutter. There's another version. There's another section that gets left off. So let me see here. So like I said, there's a lot of sort of goddess code within a lot of fairy tales. And with Little Red Riding Hood, it's quite obvious. There's the maiden mother crone. It's Little Red Riding Hood. And you'll notice too, if you're reading some of the older versions, she's called Little Red Cap or Little Red Riding Hood. There's even a native version of Little Red Riding Hood. There's another Italian version where it's the Virgin Mother, Mary, comes in as, I think it's called Little Star or something like that, and puts a star on her forehead, and she's, you know, saved by the Mother Mary. But anyways, I digress. But Little Red Riding Hood is called Little Red Riding Hood until she comes out of the belly of the wolf. And then in a lot of the older versions, you'll notice she's just called Red, because she's not little anymore, because she's matured. It's a mark of her maturity. So she's just called Red. So Red is the maiden, the mother is Red's physical mother, and of course the crone is the grandmother. So let me see here, what else? So the question is the wolf good or evil? In the story, he seems to be evil, leading Red off the safety of the path. But we do not need to venture out off the beaten path to be enlightened and gain strength. Isn't this true? The true nature of a totem helps us to grow. Sometimes this would include shadow work. So sometimes the wolf is seen as a shadow worker, making Red kind of go into those dark places. So isn't the wolf actually doing Red a favor when he eats her, as it is only then that she realizes the carelessness of her actions and decides to change? It seems like she also gains gratitude for what she does have. So many fairy tales have a symbolic death to them. The eating of the wolf, or the wolf eating Little Red Riding Hood, is that symbolic death for her to then mature, where she becomes red. And like I said, it's also done in Sleeping Beauty, it's also done in Snow White. All have gone through a death-like experience. So some of the code that is in Little Red Riding Hood, just as a for instance, there is Little Red Riding Hood, mother and grandmother. I've already mentioned that, the triple goddess kind of viewing. The crossroads where Red meets the wolf, a code among pre-Christians for a secret place of high magic, the crossroads. It's often mentioned in the occult as a place of meeting, and a place for spell working as well. The wolf devouring the grandmother is code for the church crushing one part of the triple goddess, the crone. The hot bread and milk, the code of the love dispensed by the ancient European goddesses, because a lot of them were bread goddesses and milk goddesses and things like that, because bread was another very poignant turning point for mankind. When mankind learned how to plant the seed and to farm, that meant that we were no longer nomadic. We were no longer dependent on what we could find or forage or hunt. We could grow our own vegetables and grains. And grains were the first crops that we grew. And from the grains came, our gruel or porridge and our breads, a lot of our breads, and then we could also domesticate animals because now we could feed them the grains that they required and keep them over cold climates and things like that. So it was a real turning point when bread came into our lives. Thus the reason it's in our prayers, give us this day our daily bread. Thus the reason it's attached to important things such as going to make the dough, give me the bread, it's a euphemism for money as well, which is a sign of freedom and power. Bread was seen as a sign of freedom and power. Even Marie Antoinette was actually misquoted when she said, "Let them eat cake." That's a misquote. She actually said, "Let them eat bread," because in those days, bread was considered a complete meal, a true nourishment, because of course they weren't making Wonder Bread back in those days. They were making bread from the true and whole grain. And so it was very nutritionally dense. It was also a lot denser than our Wonder Bread. So it was only at weddings that the flour, you could pay extra for the flour to be more processed. So it was a lighter flour. It wasn't, again, Wonder Bread, but it was their version of white bread. And it was only ever eaten at your wedding. You might have it once or twice in your life, kind of thing. Most of the time you had the very nutritionally dense bread, and the only thing that was missing from bread was fat. Thus the reason we put butter, even to this day, on our bread. Not that we need it, but that was what made bread complete. So that's why bread was so important. Everybody went every day to the ovens, the community ovens. The bakers really held a point of honor, a station of honor. To be a baker was a very honorable job because you were making everyone's daily bread. Because it wasn't always made it wasn't made at home like our pioneer grandmothers or whatever kind of thing. So again, the land of milk and honey, bread, and milk are three of the sort of very basic, like, you got it good if you've got those three things kind of thing. And a lot of the goddesses were surrounded those. Now wine was also another big one. So meat and wine, code for the body and blood of the sacrificed deities. That's in the story of grandmother, not in most stories. Red ingesting her grandmother's body and blood, code for gaining the sacred magic necessary to escape the wolf church. Some people say the wolf also represents the church because, again, it's supposed to be a secret pagan code that's in a lot of the fairy tales. Little Red's sewing needle path, code for one of humanity's earliest and most powerful tools, the needle, which created the manufacturing of clothing, shoes, boots, hats, coats, tents, saddles, stockings, gloves, shawls, scarves, and much, much more. So it elevated us. Bread and sewing needles, two of the big things, right? The wolf taking the path of pins, code for the church being a temporary institution and inferior with a flimsy make-do foundation. Little Red Riding Hood taking the path of needles is code for the idea that the goddess religion is safe and sound. It's underground and it's gone to sleep, but it's rising again. So Little Red's clothing, code for civilization, especially the goddess-centered civilization, a primary distinction between humans and animals, as our felt need to wear, as we feel we need to wear clothing. In the Middle Ages and before, the manufacturing of clothing was primarily the province of women. Red is an interesting color because it's the color of danger. It's also the color of sensuality. It's also the color of blood. She's entering womanhood with a lot of her experiences and her decisions. Thus, red is the color of her first menstruation. The wolf's destruction of Red's clothing by the fire, because he not only makes her strip in the story of grandmother, but he makes her burn her clothing too. So code for the church attempting wholesale destruction of the goddess culture. One is reminded of the burning of non-Christians at the stake in the early modern era. Code for the church attempting, like I said, to destroy the goddess culture, and male trying to wield its power in a destructive way because it's the male wolf stripping down the female. So the wolf's fur, the first thing Red notices that tells her he might not be her grandmother. Code for human regression to an era before the manufacturing of clothing, of when we wore animal skins and we just kind of wore them on top of ourselves. The plum tree, like I said, is in the occult world is considered unexpected magic, unexpected good luck, which is what Red gets. So I'm talking about the story of grandmother here, because the story of grandmother really is the one that has a lot of the pagan code in it. Some of it's carried over in other versions, but they've been modified and manipulated and changed, and it's kind of like a game of telephone where I'll tell you a story and then you go and tell someone the story, but it changes a little bit. We've all played that game. The wolf pretending to be grandmother is said to be the code for the church pretending to give the Europeans what the goddess could, and also taking over a lot of the places that were considered sacred and changing saints. Like in Ireland, for instance, Saint Bridget was not a real person. They made a Saint Bridget because they worshiped the triple goddess Bridget, and they wouldn't give that up. So they said, well, there's a Saint Bridget. You can pray to her and ask her for miracles, and and come to church, and we'll have a Saint Bridget at church and that sort of thing. It wasn't till like 300 years later or something, when the church first went into Ireland. The Irish are a stubborn sort, apparently. But there was a nun that they canonized that was named Bridget, and she became the Saint Bridget kind of thing. But before that, it was the goddess Bridget disguised as a saint. So then Little Red returning safely to her mother is code for prediction that in the future the goddess will win out over the church. Not that it's really a competition. I find the more I study about different spiritualities and religions, the more I figure we're all heading to the same place. We're just taking different paths. But it's still interesting history to kind of see, because to me it's a little bit funny about how we continue, even in these days, to persecute each other over our spiritual beliefs. And we want numbers. We want, you agree with me, right? This is the way to go, and this is the thing to believe in. And you know, like I say, we all have different ways of going about it. Let's just accept our differences, because really there's a lot more similarities than there are differences, in my opinion. We're all after the same things. We all want a warm bed. We all want companionship. We'd all like a lover, perhaps at one point or another. Maybe some children would be great. We want people to love us. We like to have family around us. You know, some family we could do without, some we love more than others. And we want food in our bellies, and we want, you know, some light around us, whether it's by a fire or with a lamp or whatever. We want those comforts, and we want to know there's something beyond this. We'd like to believe that there is. And we want love. We really just want love. We all want love. That's the main thing. So anything else about Little Red Riding Hood? So we have to give Little Red Riding Hood props. She lives fearlessly. First of all, she actually stops and talks to the wolf. So she gives him a chance. And then she tells him exactly where she's going, fearlessly, and how to get there. She even gives him directions. And maybe that is why Little Red Riding Hood is so universally loved. She shows us that we all make the big mistakes. That was a big mistake on her part, but she still, you know, stopped and talked to him. But she also shows us that we can get through it. We can survive, and we can live to be wary of the next wolf we meet. So that's Little Red Riding Hood in a nutshell. There's more in this book, so if you want the book, let me know. And message me either here, or you can find me on Facebook at Goddess Garage Tarot Parlor, at Instagram. You can find me Lady Rose Tarot. I'll put all the links in the description below for you. This will be on my Etsy store, so you can order that up if you like. I'd love for you to check out my Etsy store as well. And I'm so glad you were here for this little story of Little Red Riding Hood and some of her history. Take care. Have a good night. Bye.